Thank you, Phil. Thank you for that charming introduction. And thank you, everybody, for coming along. Thank you, KOTESOL, for making this possible. It's wonderful to be back at this conference, which is one of my favorite. There's lots of familiar faces in the audience, too, which makes me feel really at home here. I'm going to talk to the topic of the methodology strand of the conference title, if you remember, whatever it is. But the word methodology is in the title. Nobody ever remembers the conference titles, but I feel a kind of obligation to at least touch on the subject of methods. One of the things that, one of my great pleasures apart from meeting people who travel around from conference to conference around the world and visiting these wonderful places and eating the wonderful food, is when I get the opportunity, I kind of sneak off and look for secondhand bookshops wherever I am, because one of my hobbies is collecting old language text books, grammars, dictionaries, course books, etc. I can see you thinking, get a life, but I'm going to try and justify this hobby in the course of this talk, because it really is very, very interesting to look back in the kind of the archaeology, if you like, of our profession, looking at how methods have changed and how they haven't changed, and really that's the theme of my talk. For example, I was in Malta in the Mediterranean a couple of years ago, and I knew somewhere in Valletta, this wonderful old Mediterranean city, there would be a second-hand bookshop, and that second-hand bookshop would contain an English language text. And it took me a while actually to hunt it out, but there it is. And they had very little books left in it, actually. It's mainly been turned over to kind of souvenirs and things. But I did find this book, which was not dated, in fact, but judging by the design and the contents, which I'll share with you in a minute, probably comes from about the 30s or 40s. And this, when I got back to my hotel, caused me some amusement when I opened and had a look. For example, this is a sequence in the book. So you've got two guys. That is your mouth. This is my mouth. My hand is on my knee. Your finger is on your arm. I put my foot on your foot. Excuse me, your finger is on my nose. I challenge you to think of a context in which you actually use that. Maybe the subway in Seoul on a very busy morning. Excuse me. It gets better. You take your hand off my arm, my finger's on my chin. I take my foot off your head. By the way, your hand is on your knee. You put your finger on your leg, I take my hand off. You could turn this into a Gangnam kind of sequence, actually. But why the suits? I mean, I don't get it. I mean, if it was in a gymnasium and they were wearing like trackies or something, the suits? Anyway, so you can see, you can get a lot of amusement out of these books. And of course, they do tell us something about the methodology of the time. This is a photo then of my library, or part thereof, going way back, some of the books to the 19th century. And I just want to share a few. I mean, the design of them, apart from anything else, is really interesting, how they have evolved over the years. This is the Berlitz sequence, basically the same content, but very different design. You can see that's somewhat dated now too, the last one. And then we get, you can almost kind of get a sense of the methodology even just from the covers. This one I kind of like. This is a sort of audio-visual with a guy in his little hammock with his, his book and his record player. Classic English design and so on. This is kind of design minus, really. This is, I think this was from Georgia. And this one's kind of fun, too. This is from Barcelona during the Second Republic. So it's kind of got that sort of Soviet-ish influence just before the Spanish Civil War. So there's a lot of history, and there's a lot of, not only that, there's a lot of culture embedded in these titles. Notice how the Britishness or the Englishness of English is foregrounded with iconic references to, in this case, the Tower Bridge, the flag, of course, and the classic bowler hat and umbrella. This one is a linguaphone course, and it's actually, you can't see the small print there, but it's by appointment of Her Majesty the Queen. So this is how she learned English, presumably. Again, you've got classic English stereotypical businessman, and the phone. This one is actually from 2002 from a course published in Spain, and they're still pushing the idea of English as being associated with the Union Jack and red telephone boxes. Or if it's not, and then the titles are kind of fun too. We've got the kind of entertaining view of English, English without tears kind of thing, or this one from Germany, Laugh and Be Merry. I think this was published in 1939. I don't think it ran to many editions. And this one I like from Argentina, Toil and Chat, so a bit of both. You can also get long playing. I found a collection of long playing records. Remember those from for a Spanish market. Again, we get the iconic scene of New York here, and the kind of marketing hype, a new tested method that simplifies language study, enables anyone to learn English quickly and easily. So the hype actually hasn't changed. You'll probably see that on a lot of the book stands downstairs, that kind of upbeat message about the quickness and the ease of learning through LP records or CD-ROMs or whatever. It's also interesting when you open these books up to look how the classroom is kind of construed and has changed over the years. So this comes clearly from a very early book where you've got teacher on the podium behind the lectern, the kids all being studious. And then you get teachers. This is an interesting one because this is the same course book which was a subsequent edition. So we've got, again, the teacher at the board with glasses and pointing, and a later edition of that same book, the teacher slightly more trendy, but still wearing a suit and glasses. And always male in these early books. And very, very little technology. Here's another one where, the caricature of the teacher with mortarboard. I am the master, I'm not the mistress, just in case you thought I was. I am big, and so on. And this one I rather like. This is where the next one where technology intervenes in the scene. So we've got a scene in a kind of more modern classroom. Look at that, the tape recorder. Teacher, I am standing. Am I standing, Dick? Yes, you are. Where am I? You're standing in front of us. So, very authentic piece of classroom discourse. Not. Look how motivated the students are by the presence of the tape recorder. What does that say about technology? We get female teachers, but only usually teaching young learners. So this is kind of clearly from a 50s kind of course. Here, a little bit later, we've got Sarah Palin as English teacher. If you remember Sarah Palin, I didn't think that joke would still have any currency, but it obviously does. And of course, there's a lot of information about the methods too. Here's a course I found in Barcelona, and again, there's the map of the British Isles, just to remind you that English belongs to the British. This one lacks a little bit on the design front. I don't know, they didn't lash out on graphic illustrators. You can. Not the best picture in the world, but I like the text. I am a man, I have a round head. As if that were the defining characteristic of a man. My legs and so on. And it's kind of interesting looking at, this is very much an audio-visual course or audio-lingual course, so there are drills all the way through. I don't know whether you can see this, I kind of like this is interesting. So the prompt is, did we have a house in the country? Answer, yes, you did. You had a beautiful house. This is kind of English for amnesiacs. Did I have many things? So, but on the subject of methods, it's kind of interesting. One of the things, the way that methods are instantiated in course books, and it's interesting from the point of view of being a Spanish speaker as a second language, how the word method and course book are sort of conflated. They're used interchangeably. Method, so this is a cover. So the new British method, it's the método d'Inglés. And I was always confused about this, especially when I would visit South America, and people would say to me, what is your method? Or have you written a new method, etc. And the two ideas do seem to have become conflated in many people's minds. It's not just a linguistic thing. This is a page from that same book. Why do you always recommend this method? Because it's both practical and pleasant. Pleasant is not an adjective that is normally associated with methods. In fact, if you do a corpus search of the collocations of the word method, I use the corpus of contemporary American English online, you find that the most common collocation with collocate with method or adjective is new, and then you get a list: scientific, best, effective, simple, other, only, different. So again, there's very much a feeling that methods are scientific, they are good. I mean, these are fairly positive adjectives, and they're associated with modernity. Of course, if we look at the history of the method concept, we find that the word method has become slightly antiquated in terms of what we talk about. There was a kind of, after that flourish of methods post-audiolingualism, when there was this kind of black hole that had to be filled, where you get the silent way and TPR and all these kind of things, the word method became slightly discredited. It was felt perhaps it was too prescriptive, and when the communicative approach came along, it was the idea of an approach being somehow less confining, less constraining, less prescriptive than a method, and with a wider application in a variety of contexts. It's kind of a sort of a theoretical construct, and you derive your method from it. But of course, subsequently, in the mid-90s, we saw a reaction against even the notion of an approach, with people writing about the fact that we're in the post-method era, for example. We've gone beyond methods. There are a number of titles that came out in the mid-90s that the method is dead, or why are methods dead, etc. And a more recent treatment of the same theme is suggesting that, in fact, methods have been replaced by textbooks. So this conflation of metodo and textbook has become a reality. An Iranian academic called Akbari says the concept of method has not been replaced by the concept of post-method, but rather by an era of textbook-defined practice. What the majority of teachers teach and how they teach are now determined by textbooks. Well, I'm not going to comment on that. It's an interesting proposition, one that you might like to consider, but it does suggest that textbooks are, in many contexts at least, what teachers do. Yeah? They teach the book, certainly at the early stages of their career. So, on that note, I'd like to move on now and looking at, well, let's just take another example. This is a book I found quite recently in a secondhand bookshop in Barcelona, and it's a beautiful book. It came out in various editions, various languages, so there's a German equivalent, a French equivalent, and so on. And it's all taught by pictures. So this is very much part of kind of the direct method movement. It came out in the 30s. And so each page is a double spread, or a spread of wonderfully drawn pictures, which are all carefully enumerated parts of the body in this case, or in this case, a typical landscape pre-war Europe. Useful vocabulary. But what was interesting about this book was the author's introduction, which was quite short, and how she anticipated it being used. And I thought this was kind of, we're talking 1930s here, and I thought this was kind of cool. She says, in oral and written exercises of all kinds, an effort must be made to associate the matter under treatment with the pupil's own observations, to illustrate it from his own experience. And I thought this was kind of interesting when we think the notion of personalization, authenticating the language in the classroom, is a relatively recent development, because it goes way back, that people were talking about this kind of thing even then. So this is what really interests me, is how these ideas sort of come around and come around. And we're kind of misled into the view that methodology has been a kind of a steady progress from darkness into the light. But there was a lot of light shed on language teaching methodology over 50 or more years ago. So I'd like to just share with you, one of the things I also collect is old methodology books. And here is a selection. And I've just extracted some quotations from some of these books. And I'd like you to dwell on them. I'm going to have people in the audience who have been primed to read out the quotations. And at each, and you'll see it on the screen, at each quotation, I want you to think, is this good advice or not so good advice? And then we'll do a kind of yay or nay. Okay, you ready? So who's got number one? Mike, can you read it out?
Find your point of contact in the daily experience of the foreigner and lead him as speedily as possible into touch with the language of daily life.
Okay, now digest that, and then I want you to say yay or nay in a big loud voice if you agree with this sentiment. That was pathetic. Can we have that again? Yes. Okay, I think this, I mean, we're talking 1918 here, but this does seem to me to make very much common sense. This is a book for immigrants into the United States, but by emphasizing the importance of making the language of the classroom relevant to their needs, we are way ahead of our time. Okay, who's got number 2? Ken.
Language is not a sterile subject we can find in the classroom. One of two things must be done. Either life must be brought into the classroom, or the class must be taken to life.
What do you say? Yes, the way you do it, exactly. So again, this seems to be an eloquent piece of wisdom, and I think it's particularly interesting, this quotation, in the light of how difficult it must have been in those days to bring the outside world into the classroom, or vice versa. But of course now with technology we're able to do this at a click of a switch with the so-called porous classroom. Who's got number 3? Okay.
The student should never be called upon to say anything that is not already learned.
Yay or nay? Yes, English this way, my way, not your way. So this is very much situated in its time. If you think back, if anybody in the room can, to 1964, there was this kind of sort of, in a sense, regression, if you like, a methodology to this very much teacher-led, structure-led approach. So that one will give a big question mark too. Okay, what are we up to? Number 4? Gwenny.
The teacher must really be himself and give himself, talking to real people about real things, and then training his pupils to talk to one another about real things.
Yes. 1961, Lionel Billows, a wonderful, ahead of his time methodologist. And again, apart from the sexual bias of the pronouns, I think there's something about that quotation that makes it very, very contemporary. The notion of realness, of course, has been emphasized more recently and substituted by the word authentic, but I mean, I think the sentiment still holds. Okay, who's got number, what are we up to? 5?
A commanded structure is more easily acquired by reading, speaking, and writing the language than by hearing and studying explanations.
Again? Well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, some of you may have been in two minds about this. It's not saying that there's no place for hearing and studying explanations, but this is very much the kind of acquisition versus learning polarity, if you like, that it anticipates by almost 30 years the work of Stephen Krashen. And who's got number, what are we up to? I've lost count. Is it 6? Number 6? Yeah.
The key to language learning is well-planned and lively.
What do I hear? I notice that, they qualify it with well-planned and lively to kind of make it sound slightly more upbeat, but really, hello, this is still, we don't have the date here, but I imagine this is probably, again, in that kind of, when things dipped into audiolingualism. Okay, and number 7?
We teach grammar through conversation, and not as some school teachers attempt conversation through grammar.
Yeah, okay. Can I have a yay, please? Yeah, this is actually from that Toil and Chat I told you about, that Argentinian book. Where the toil comes in, I don't exactly know, but they're very much... Of course, when they said conversation in 1953, when you look at the conversations that they've modeled, they were incredibly controlled, contrived, and inauthentic. But nevertheless, I think the sentiment is pretty good. Are we up to number 8? Have we got a number 8? Yeah.
The language must not be allowed to stay in prison between the pages of a book.
Even a book by Ken Wilson. This is the wonderful Lionel Billows again. And number 9? Where's number 9? Yeah. Can you process that? Do you agree? Yeah? No? You don't? Good. Say it out loud. Good. He meant extremely well. When I was trained, this was almost a mantra that as a trainee teacher you had to kind of recite every time you went into the lesson. That, in a sense, was the order of activities. That dictated the order of activities in the classroom. Of course, we now have got, and the idea was really to guard against any errors creeping in to the process. Of course, we've got a lot more relaxed now about error, but I think there's still a residual feeling that that's common sense. So we'll credit Louis Alexander, who was way ahead of his time, and actually turned audiolingualism around at that kind of cusp when communicative language teaching was coming in to its own. And one more, number 10. Do I have? Yes. Angel. Yeah, great advice from French in 1949. So you can see here, thank you very much, that was audience participation. Now you can relax, there will be no more. So you can see here, as I said before, I mean, traditionally when you do a course in methods, there's a sort of sense that the history of methods has been one of the steady progress, the modern narrative, as it were, from darkness into light, or as a kind of not dissimilar to a kind of evolutionary process. So you've got the evolution of species from the mere amoeba right through to the man with a newspaper at the top, or if you want to map onto it, some of the key figures in the history of methods. You've got people like Berlitz, Palmer, Skinner, Chomsky, and the wonderful Henry Widdowson at the top. But of course, if we look at those quotations, we see that really it's not really like that. If you like, as Alistair Pennycook pointed out in a paper in 1989, it's more of a cyclical process when good ideas keep coming around, but with different sort of nuances or different configurations. These changes have represented different configurations of the same basic options. And so what I want to look at in this next part of the talk is what these particular options are. And I've kind of collected, I've represented them as kinds of dimensions, if you like, or a spectrum rather than straight polarities. And I've organized them according to a model of methodology which Richards and Schmidt use, I think, in their Dictionary of Applied Linguistics. So one of the distinguishing features of any method, if you like, is how what view it takes of language, whether on the one hand it's mainly formal or whether it is more functional. So we've got that big kind of dichotomy between form and function, which has in fact run through the whole of linguistics in the last more than 100 years. And then the nature of learning, whether it's construed as being an analytic, cognitive, intellectual process or one that is more experiential. So progressive education, for example, is associated with experiential learning going way back to the work of John Dewey. The goals of second language learning can be construed along a spectrum as well, from being a focus mainly on accuracy, which was how I was first trained, to the push towards a focus on communication, even at the expense of accuracy. The type of syllabus that's used can be considered as part of for two different dimensions, whether the focus is mainly on the systems, by that I mean the grammar, phonology, vocabulary, etc., or whether it's a focus more on the skills, reading, speaking, writing, and so on. Of course, this is not saying that it's an either-or choice. The two may be well integrated. But if you look at the syllabus of any textbook, it'll tend to be, something will be foregrounded, and which will drive, in fact, the rest of the syllabus with it. And then whether the syllabus is segregated, in other words, English is taught as a separate subject, or whether it is integrated into the rest of the curriculum through, for example, content learning, content and language integrated learning, and so on, immersion, and so on. And then, what is the role of the teacher and the learner and the materials? Is the focus more on cognition? There's a bit of repeat here, in a sense, the kind of the analytical end of the spectrum, cognition, or is there a move to taking into account the affective factors that affect learning, emotions, anxiety, pleasure, stress, etc.? and whether the teaching style is a transmissive one, the teacher, remember, standing behind the dais on lecturing the students, or whether it's more dialogic in the sense that a number of educationists have used, whether it's a more interpretive, if you like, methodology with question and answers going in both directions. And so, and finally, the actual teaching procedures, whether they are essentially deductive, in other words, rules are given and then applied and practiced, or whether they're inductive, where the learners are encouraged to work out the rules themselves and not necessarily explicate them, and whether the methodology takes into account the learner's first language or not, whether it's a bilingual one versus a monolingual one, English only, or target language only. So these are, I think, 9 different, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, yeah, 9 different dimensions, if you like, or configurations. Well, the configurations are where the method, in a sense, situates itself along those dimensions. Bearing in mind, as I said before, it's not necessarily totally one or totally the other. But if we did have to think of a method that was kind of like way over here at this end of the spectrum in many of these different dimensions, what might it be? In other words, a method that focused on form, was analytic, accuracy focused on the systems, was segregated from the curriculum, was very cognitive, transmissive role of the teacher, deductive, giving rules, and bilingual, which used the learner's own language. What would that be? Grammar translation, exactly. So it's almost a definition of a grammar translation approach, which, again, is still alive and well in many contexts. If we move way over onto the other side of the map, what might a method be, or an approach be, which captures these kind of characteristics, where the language, the focus is on function, it's experiential learning, communication rather than accuracy, a skills-based, of course, it's perhaps integrated into the curriculum, where the students or the learner's affect is taken into account, it's more dialogic, students experience the language and work out the rules, and is probably monolingual. What would that be? Okay, so the whole language movement, yeah, if you come from the States, or its equivalent, if you like, and we've seen some very interesting presentations here on project-based learning, for example, activity-based learning, task-based learning. It's very much the kind of the strong view of the communicative approach, one that's probably not represented in textbooks so much, but does happen in certain contexts. So those would be the kind of the extremes, if you like, of those configurations. But probably where most teachers operate is somewhere in a kind of wiggly line down the middle, no? I mean, if this was a workshop, I'd put you into groups, and you could draw your own wiggly line where you situate yourself typically in relation to these dimensions. So the point really is, it's these dimensions remain constant. It's where people situate themselves and where materials situate themselves, which is the variable, if you like, and that determines the methodology. I'm just going to now do a little bit of, I'm going to apply these dimensions to a method that, well, an approach, methodology, whatever you want to call it, that I happen to have become associated with. And that is this. Well, that's the logo that we use on the website. I don't know how much background I'm going to have to fill in here, but I'll just do a little bit of, in 2000, year 2000, I suggested, slightly facetiously, that we were, as teachers, as a profession, over-resourced at the expense of the kind of, this end of the spectrum kind of qualities of methodology. In fact, that the materials and resources that we were using then, and we're talking 12 years ago, were kind of not actually facilitating communication, real authentic language use, but sometimes they were inhibiting it. And it was this that started a kind of discussion that's still ongoing on a website called the Dogma ELT group. Now, Dogma, spelt with an E, by association with that film movement, long since kind of extinguished itself, that reacted against the high-tech Hollywood kind of films that were, they felt, these Danish filmmakers, or Scandinavian filmmakers, were felt stifling the market and creativity. And so they were calling for a kind of an essentialist, a minimalist approach to filmmaking, which required little in the way of big budgets, etc. This, to me, at the time, seemed an interesting analogy. Now, and so we get as I say, in this original, somewhat facetious statement of the principles of this approach, which echoed the statement made by the filmmakers about their approach, I suggested at the time that teaching should be done using only the resources that teachers and students bring to the classroom, that is themselves, and whatever happens to be in the classroom, and so on and so on and so on. So that this, as I say, was a reactive statement which seemed to be an idea whose time for many teachers had come, because we got a very positive response. And as I say, the website still continues, and there's been books written, and there's, as Phil pointed out, there are presentations at this conference called Teaching Unplugged, which is the kind of how the Dogma movement, if you like, has been relabeled. And then over time, the negativity of these statements, this kind of like the notion that course books are bad, that technology is bad per se, has been tempered by a little bit of reason, so that recognizing the fact that course books are here to stay, technology is here to stay, and may be a very good thing. And so in 2009, my colleague Luke Meddings and I kind of decided to extract what we thought were the principles of this approach which had survived the polemic. In other words, which seemed to get at the heart of what Dogma is all about, and seemed to be more positive rather than negative. And really, they boil down to these three different principles: that Dogma is about teaching that is conversation-driven, about teaching that is materials light, only because the materials lightness provides more space for the learner-centeredness, if you like. That's all. And then Dogma is about teaching that focuses on emergent language, the language that emerges from the conversations that learners have in the classroom, or the tasks that they are asked to do. It doesn't have to be spoken, it can be written. So these seem to be the principles which, as I say, were extracted from all this 10 years of somewhat heady and sometimes almost, what's the word? Well, often quite heated debate. Now, the question I'm often asked then, as I go around, is Dogma a method? And aren't you just trying to set yourself up as another kind of like, oh, I've got a method too? And I would argue, just as I argue there aren't any methods as such, there's only these different configurations of those dimensions, that Dogma very much is just another set of configurations which shares a lot with other so-called methods. And if you look back on some of those quotations that I shared with you earlier from these older course books, that all of which predate the advent of the Dogma method, you'll realize that the fundamental principles of teaching unplugged or Dogma have been around for a very long time. Just to remind you, so there's our dimensions. Of course, Dogma probably is situated more over that end of the scale, but as I say, has antecedents which go back to these kind of quotations. Find your point of contact in the daily experience of the learners and lead them as speedily as possible into touch with the language of daily life. That seems to be a core Dogma principle. Either life must be brought to the classroom or the class must be taken to life. So again, the notion of authenticating and making relevant the language learning experience. The teacher must really be, I've corrected the gender bias here, be herself and give herself, talking to real people about real things, and then training her pupils to talk to one another about real things. A commanded structure is more easily acquired by reading, speaking, and writing the language than by hearing and studying explanations. And I think this is a kind of Dogma tenet in a sense, that it's more acquisition focused rather than, but it doesn't mean to say that there needn't be some focus on form. We teach grammar through conversation, and not as some school teachers attempt conversation through grammar. So conversation, however you construe conversation, the larger sense of kind of language, the voice, if you like, of the learners is made central to the process, and out of that, the language that is focused on emerges, the notion of an emergent grammar, as it were, which is not a million miles from task-based learning. And finally, the language must not be allowed to stay imprisoned in the pages of a book. I mean, you all agree that that is sound practice. And what should the pupils feel about all our English classes generally? First, they should feel that each lesson is their lesson, not the teacher's. In an English class which is well run, the teacher is only a guide. So as I say, I feel kind of that vindicated by these statements. This is the plus side of collecting all these books as I go around. And by the way, if anybody knows where the secondhand bookshops are in Seoul, please tell me. I've got one afternoon left to add to my collection. I have nothing from Korea. So as I say, this is the fun, the charm, and the interest in looking back at our history and realizing that where we are now, it's not necessarily the end point of a long evolutionary process, but it's just another set of configurations.